So my cohorts in all this effort I'll be talking to you about today are members of Louisiana Environmental Action Network. Mary Dior, stand up Mary D, is the executive director. And my two knights in shining armor are her sons, Paul Orr, who is the Lower Mississippi River Keeper, and Michael Orr. Stand up, Michael. So what you will be hearing today is the work that the four of us have been doing since that magic day, April the 20th. Earth Day was supposed to be a really special day for us. Mary Dior and Lean and I and Paul and Michael had been working with John Bowermaster, and he had put together a companion book to Oceans, the Disney movie. And I had written one of the chapters. There were 30 chapters in the book, and he selected people from across the world to write chapters. And the book Oceans was being released on Earth Day, and it was going to be a really special Earth Day. And in fact, it was a really horrible Earth Day. Next slide. From the day the rig exploded and burned, it started dumping Louisiana sweet crude and natural gas from the wellhead, which was 5,000 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. And the Louisiana sweet crude and natural gas flowed from that well from April the 20th through July 15, 2010. BP had goals. Their goals were two. One, stop the flow of oil from the wellhead. And two, stop as much of that crude oil from making it to the shores and having an impact on the wetlands and beaches of the northern Gulf of Mexico. The crude oil actually hit the beaches 9 days after the explosion. So that was their first goal that didn't work. And as you know, the one of stopping the crude didn't happen until July 15th. So they didn't meet any of their initial goals they had set forth. The crude oil migrated into the wetlands, marshes, estuaries, and beaches of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the panhandle of Florida. There are two human populations that were impacted the most. And we will hear a lot more about other populations, but initially there were two. There were community members living along the coastal areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the panhandle of Florida. And then there were the fishermen and workers who were employed by BP and BP contractors to install booms and clean up the crude oil. Both of these communities consisted of environmental justice communities, African Americans, Vietnamese, Pacific Islanders, Laotian, and Native Americans. The cleanup workers were exposed to the crude oil and dispersants on a daily and ongoing basis over a period of 4 to 5 months. A lesser number of workers are still being exposed. There are workers today out there working for BP and BP contractors trying to address the crude and the dispersants that are still in the environment and still being exposed today. The pathways of exposure are inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact. The workers were not provided with adequate and appropriate training, and they weren't provided with protective equipment. There were two dispersants that were used, 9500 and 9527 of Corexit. 1.84 million gallons of Corexit 9500 and 9527 were applied to the BP crude oil spill. 1.07 million gallons were applied to the surface on what you saw on a lot of the TV programs as the slick on the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. 771,000 gallons were applied subsurface near the wellhead. And the idea of applying it subsurface is as the crude flowed out of the wellhead, it was supposed to be mixed with the dispersant. And in fact, they formed two layers. You didn't have that mixing. But the interesting thing is, if you believe the numbers, for every 93 gallons of crude oil that flowed out of the wellhead and was released into the environment, 1 gallon of dispersant was applied. 93 gallons of crude released into the environment, 1 gallon of dispersant released into the environment. So in addition to the crude oil spill, we had a huge, huge dispersant released into the environment. And that always has seemed to be the forgotten portion of the impacts to the environment and human health. So here I've listed for you the human health associated with the dispersants. You look down this list and you'll see short-term headaches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and then you see long-term, the damage to the blood cells. People were talking today about internal bleeding as a result of damage to the red blood cells. Cardiovascular problems. There are two up here that we haven't seen yet. Other than those two, we have seen all of these health impacts that are associated with the crude, with the dispersant in the people that were workers and were people that lived along the coast. The two we haven't seen are genetic damage and mutations and reproductive and developmental damage. Now we're at 9 months from the initial flowing of the wellhead. So are we not seeing them, or are people not associating reproductive and developmental damage? Probably people are not associating it back, but those are the two things we're now looking for really closely, because we're now 9 months out, and there is the potential to start seeing all of these, including the genetic and the reproductive damage. The dispersant was last applied, quote, on July 19, 2010. It was limited to 3 miles from the shore. It was supposedly done out near the wellhead. However, after July 19th, and even before that date, we are continuing to hear over and over again from the people in the coastal areas and the wetlands that dispersant is being applied by airplane and by boat, by the Carolina skiffs and by airplane. I've been reporting that to the federal agents over and over again. And their response initially was, it can't be applied in the coastal areas. It can't be closer than 3 miles from the shore, which is the Louisiana waters. And this is all the way across the coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida. So they know of the complaints. I'm still getting the complaints. I got one Friday that said they had sprayed the night before by airplane. And the feds will listen to me, but they won't talk back to me because they say it's a criminal investigation. But that doesn't get any help for the people in this room and the people on the coastal areas. So it's really critical that if you hear a plane or if you see a boat spraying, that you call it in to your parish, your county, your state agency, get it recorded. So when I told you for every 93 gallons of crude that was released into the environment, 1 gallon of dispersant was applied, that doesn't count what has been applied along the coastal areas. So the pathways of exposure when you come into contact with the crude itself are inhaling it, ingesting it, your skin, and eye and skin contact. Someone mentioned when I came in today that someone had lost the sight in their eyes from being exposed. So the gentleman back there just raised his hand. So these are the health impacts from the crude. The first one I showed you were the health impacts from the dispersant. Every one of these except the ones with the star, mutation and birth defects and infertility, have been reported in association with contact or exposure to the crude. And once again, we're 9 months out. So we're watching to see if we start picking up mutations and birth defects and infertility. But do you think anybody's going to call me and say, I had a miscarriage, or I can't get pregnant? People aren't going to report that. They're going to report skin rashes, respiratory, that whole kidney problems. But these are going to be the two that are going to be the hardest to document associated with the crude. So let's go back to those two populations that were initially identified. And they were identified by myself, Mary Lee, Paul, and Michael. Crude oil turned into an aerosol when the slip was present in the Gulf of Mexico. It was due to the high winds and the high seas, and it came on shore. And I give an example of when you use a pump hairspray, that's an aerosol that comes out of the pump. So that's what the crude oil was like coming on shore. It moved on shore way before the slick, and remember it only took 9 days for the slick to make it to shore. And it continued to move on shore every time the wind blew from the south, southeast, or southwest, blowing it on shore. People initially called and said they had headaches, nausea, respiratory impacts, irritation to the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs, asthma attacks. Those were the complaints. As far inland as New Orleans, and you're at mile marker 100 on the river, people in the New Orleans area were reporting these health impacts when the wind blew from the south. Some parents would talk about they'd bring their child to the doctor, and the closer they made it upriver to go to the doctor, the better the child felt. And then when they finished at the doctor and headed south, the child got sicker and sicker and sicker. These health impacts are all along from New Iberia, Louisiana, along Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the panhandle of Florida, having these huge health impacts on the community that had nothing to do with the spill and had nothing to do with working to clean up the mess. Then we have the fishermen and the cleanup workers. They experience these same health impacts, but much more severe, because they were right there in contact with it. When they leaned over the boat to pull in the boom, the oil was right there in front of their face. They had skin irritation and sores, difficulty breathing, chest pains, diminished lung function, depression, and suicide tendencies. After Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, Mary Lee and I asked for mental health providers to come into the area, and a lot of the foundations said, we don't do mental health, and we kept telling them how depressed the people were in the area after the hurricanes. Once again, we saw the depression, particularly in the fishing communities, which didn't know from day to day whether they were going to have a livelihood or not. And then we started having suicides, a lot in the fishing community, and a lot of people were on suicide watch. And the depression is growing day by day by day, because it appears to most of these people that there is no end in sight. The cleanup workers are continuing to get sick, and their health impacts cover the long list associated with the crude and the dispersant that I just showed you. So working with Louisiana Environmental Action Network, Lean provided protective gear and respirators to the fishing workers beginning on May 4th. Mary Lee is a phenomenal person, puts in the order, gets it in, and she and the boys distributed to the fishing community who so desperately wanted those cleanup jobs with BP because, one, they didn't have a job. Two, it was their marshes, their estuaries, they knew it the best, and they wanted to protect it as much as possible. Lean and fishermen challenged the BP in U.S. District Court on May the 7th. BP signed a consent decree to take responsibility to ensure workers were protected, that they were trained and they were provided with protective equipment. They signed that agreement on May the 7th. Did it happen? No. Fishermen fearing the loss of their jobs and wouldn't speak up. Their wives spoke up and were telling everybody they could how sick their husbands were, until BP told the husbands, if your wives don't shut up, you're going to lose your job. So then we moved up the ladder of responsibility to OSHA. OSHA is the one who is in charge of protecting worker safety on the job. Interacting with OSHA on their lack of enforcement of worker protection and safety regulations, I had a conference here in New Orleans, and Dr. Michaels, one of the heads of OSHA, was there, and he and I had lunch together, and I told him what the situation was, because Mary Lee and I wound up being the voice of the fishing community. So I told him what was going on, and he said, we have a problem. I said, I know we have a problem, and these people are really sick, and OSHA is not doing anything to protect these workers. On May 16th, OSHA issued a directive on requiring pertaining and protective gear. BP continued to fail to provide the respirators and the protective gear. Mary Lee kept providing them to the fishing community who were working. Workers continued to be required to work while coming in direct contact and inhaling the crude oil and the dispersants. On May 24th, OSHA stated they had serious concerns for workers' safety and health and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill response. The system BP currently had in place for workers' safety, health training, and protective equipment are not adequate, according to OSHA, for the current situation or the projected increase in cleanup operations. So OSHA made a statement, and yet workers continue to be exposed and suffer the health impacts throughout the cleanup effort. The BP spill containment and cleanup is a workplace environment. It is unacceptable for workers to be made sick in the worst case place environment in 2010 and continuing in 2011. So those of you who work in industry or other businesses, are you allowed to be made sick in a workplace environment? And yet the workers that were doing the cleanups are required to go to work every day, and as a result of that requirement are made sick every day. It's a workplace environment that they should be being protected by the federal government. And it just, every day, it's a new issue. So then the National Institute of Health, known as NIEHS, on August the 17th, came out with a preliminary plan. We have been dealing with them on conference calls for a month as they developed this plan and expressing our support and our opposition to specific issues. So the plan was the Gulf Coast worker study, and it was going to track the health impacts of oil spill workers and volunteers. So Wilma says, there's another whole community, the people on the coastal areas, that are not included in your study. They need to be included. Well, Wilma, we received $10 million from BP, and we received $10 million from the federal government. So we can only do workers that did the cleanup and volunteers. So Wilma says, but in doing this, you're not providing them with medical care. You're looking at their health impacts and tracking their health impacts over the long haul. Tracking is wonderful, but if you don't have medical care to refer them to, you're just sending them back home sick till the next time it's time to update your tracking. They have limited the study to 75,000 individuals from Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida. So if you're not included in this 75,000, your health impacts will not be tracked over the long term. And when you looked at those health symptoms from the dispersant and the crude, you saw a lot of them are chronic long-term health impacts. So if you're not part of the 75,000, you're not part of anybody paying attention. The NIEHS study does not address that large population of community on the shore, as I just told you, and it doesn't provide medical attention. So even though the study will do wonderful things, it doesn't address all of the people that have been impacted by the BP crude. The crude oil flowed into the Gulf for 87 days. 207 million gallons of crude flowed into the wetlands from the wellhead. 172 million gallons were released into the environment. 35 million gallons were captured by 2 ships that they put out there. One captured the oil and burned off the gas. The second ship they put out captured the oil and gas and burned it all off. So how much crude oil is remaining in the environment? The estimate was 53 million gallons in mid-September of 2010. First of all, we think this is a very underestimation. But let's just assume we looked at the 53 million gallons that are left in mid-September. That's more than 4 times the total volume of the Exxon Valdez remaining in the environment in mid-September. So we've done recent monitoring and sampling all along the coast. With my knights in shining armor, Paul Orr and Michael Orr, take out the boat. I went out a large number of times initially, and then they've taken over. The temperature was 100 degrees when we left the dock in the morning. It was a wonderful situation. We've sampled from the Birdfoot area at the mouth of the Mississippi, Timberlier, Terrebonne Bay, and Atchafalaya Bay to demonstrate, one, the presence of the crude oil in the marshes and wetlands, and to assess the tissue, aquatic tissue. We've looked at oil in dead birds, mammals, aquatic organisms. They're spread all along the wetlands and beaches. You saw just tons of pictures of these things, and yet they're trying to tell us there's not much oil left. So when we look at the wetlands and ecosystems, we sample the sediment. We sample for alkylated polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, which are known and suspected to cause cancer. We found 6 to 89 of these polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, and the fingerprint matched the PAH fingerprint of the BP crude. We looked at oil range organics, and there was as much as 1% oil range organics. And oil range organics basically encompass the material in the crude oil. So the fingerprint matched BP in the soil and sediment. 60% of the soil sediment samples had up to 18 PAHs in excess of the marine sediment screening level. And these were areas that no one was looking to do any cleanup or remediation. Arsenic also exceeded the marine sediment screening levels. And all of the areas sampled had soil sediments contaminated with alkylated PAHs and oil range organic petroleum hydrocarbons. So then we did tissue. The first set of oysters we did when we reported, and all of these reports are on the lean website, leanweb.org. We had a lot of pushback from the oyster industry and a lot from the federal and state agencies. The oysters we sampled were not visibly oiled. They looked good. They looked like oysters you would eat. And the oysters we collected and analyzed, there was up to 8,000 to 12,000 milligrams per kilogram, part per million oil range organics. And again, these were not visibly oiled oysters. Had the alkylated PAHs, 4-amprene, naphthalene, and the others you see here. known and suspected to cause cancer. Then we looked at blue crabs, up to 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per kilogram oil range organics, and then alkylated PAHs. And I want you to remember these oil range organic numbers when I talk to you about what the Food and Drug Administration has done in just a minute. We did shrimp, 8,000 milligrams per kilogram oil range organic, and the alkylated PAHs. We did mussel, almost 7,000 milligrams per kilogram oil range organics, and alkylated PAHs. And finfish, up to 21,000 oil range organics. Remember, none of these samples looked visibly oiled. So Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is the administrator of NOAA, on September 15, had a press conference. And she stated over and over and over again at that press conference, seafood is free of contamination in Louisiana. Standing behind her at the press conference was the seafood industry of Louisiana. So I looked at the data that NOAA and the other federal agencies had accumulated. 43% of the oyster sample contained polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. 24% of all the seafood sampled through August 26 contained PAHs. And she's saying seafood is free of contamination. Now the levels were below the levels that FDA established as safe. However, they were contaminants. Dr. Lubchenco should have stated that the seafood contained contaminants below the level of concern developed by the FDA for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I contacted her and she did change her statement 10 days later to more represent that the seafood doesn't have contaminants in it, but they are below the levels established by FDA. So let's look at those levels by FDA. They began testing seafood with the sensory or smell tests. Remember all those pictures on TV? And if they smell bad, then they did the analysis. They established levels of concern for the PAHs in shrimp, crabs, oysters, and finfish. The levels of concern were elevated above what normal FDA and EPA levels of concern for seafood. Here's the list. Remember those were on the previous slides. Next. So the FDA stated when they established that list and those levels of concern, we have developed specific PAH seafood levels of concern for the unprecedented Deepwater Horizon oil spill event and will not necessarily be applicable after all fisheries are reopened for safe harvest. The FDA levels of concern were based on consumption rates that were way below what people on the Gulf Coast consume. 4 jumbo shrimp per week. How many of you eat 4 jumbo shrimp at a serving? Raise your hand if you only eat 4 or less. How many of you eat more than 4 when you sit down to eat shrimp? Per week, remember. Thus, the levels of concern were based on criteria that wasn't appropriate for the population that they were applying those levels to. We've been doing blood testing for volatile solvents. The BP crude and the dispersant have volatile solvents in them. Air sampling along the coast, independent air sampling along the coast, is picking up the volatile solvents that have also been detected in the blood of individuals that have been tested. So it's in the crude, it's in the dispersant, it's in the air, and it's in the people who have had their blood tested. The people who have had their blood tested have had medical symptoms, and that is why they requested to have their blood sampled. The blood samples contain benzene, known human cancer-causing agent. Benzene is known to cause leukemia, and I had a call this week from a case of leukemia along the Mississippi Gulf Shore. Ethylbenzene, xylene, hexane, 2-methylpentane and 3-methylpentane, and isooctane. The benzene, the ethylbenzene, the xylene, and the hexane correspond to what we're finding in the air and what's in the dispersant and the crude. And these chemicals are found in the blood. So, what kind of levels? These chemicals are found over the levels you would find in a normal population. The benzene, known human cancer-causing agent, was 36 times higher than the average, which is called the NHANES 95 percentile. The ethylbenzene was 5.7 times. New data that we received Thursday and Friday of this week, the highest ethylbenzene is 10.7 times the normal. Xylene, 5.68 times. So these are not just a little bit over, they're way over what you would find in the normal population. Individuals with the highest of these chemicals in the blood was a male diver who reported diving through the crude slick. He's 47 years old. He had ethylbenzene 5.6 times acceptable, xylene 5.68 times, he had hexane, he had 2-methylpentane, he had 3-methylpentane, he had isooctane. Then we have a 10-year-old male. His family are crabbers. He had 2-methylpentane, the highest of any samples we have today. 3-methylpentane, the highest of any samples today. The isooctane, the benzene, the ethylbenzene, the xylene, and the hexane. And again, these health symptoms that these people reported, because we had them filled out some forms when we had the blood drawn, they actually match those health symptoms I showed you for the crude and the dispersant. So where is the oil in the environment now? It's along the shore, in the wetlands and estuaries. It's on the beaches, some on the surface of the beach, some shallow surface of the beach. It's in the estuaries and the wetlands. It's in the near shore areas. It's in the subsurface water column from 3,000 to 4,300 feet depth in the Gulf of Mexico. The sediment surface on the Gulf of Mexico seafloor, somebody gave me some coral coated with oil that was taken out in the area near the Deepwater Horizon. There's light sheens of oil remaining in the Gulf and the Bay areas. The subsurface oil, when the winds are right, get brought inland and deposited again on the shores. Oil continues to wash up on the shore as tar balls and mats and streams. The environmental and human health impacts of the BP spill will last for generations. This is what we have to look forward to. Next. Thank you.
Mobile broadcast news.
So my cohorts in all this effort I'll be talking to you about today are members of Louisiana Environmental Action Network. Mary Dior, stand up Mary D, is the executive director. And my two knights in shining armor are her sons, Paul Orr, who is a Lower Mississippi River keeper, and Michael Orr. Stand up, Michael. So what you will be hearing today is the work that the four of us have been doing since that magic day, April the 20th. Earth Day was supposed to be a really special day for us, Mary Dior and Lean and I and Paul and Michael had been working with John Barmaster, and he had put together a number of workers are still being exposed. There are workers today out there working for BP and BP contractors trying to address the crude and the dispersants that are still in the environment and still being exposed today. The pathways of exposure are inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact. The workers were not provided with adequate and appropriate training, and they weren't provided with protective equipment. There were two dispersants that were used, 9500 and 9527 of Corexit. 1.84 million gallons of Corexit 9500 and 9527 were applied to the BP crude oil spill. One populations that were impacted the most. And we will hear a lot more about other populations, but initially there were two. There were community members living along the coastal areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida. And then there were the fishermen and workers who were employed by BP and BP contractors to install booms and clean up the crude oil. Both of these communities consisted of environmental justice communities, African Americans, Vietnamese, Pacific Islanders, Laotian, and Native Americans. The cleanup workers were exposed to the crude oil and dispersants on a daily and ongoing basis over a period of 4 to 5 months. A letter, a companion book to Oceans, the Disney movie. And I had written one of the chapters. There were 30 chapters in the book, and he selected people from across the world to write chapters. And the book Oceans was being released on Earth Day, and it was going to be a really special Earth Day. And in fact, it was a really horrible Earth Day. Next slide. From the day the rig exploded and burned, it started dumping Louisiana sweet crude and natural gas from the wellhead, which was 5,000 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. And the Louisiana sweet crude and natural gas flowed from that well from April the 20th through July 15, 2010. BP had goals. Their goals were two. One, stop the flow of oil from the wellhead. And two, stop as much of that crude oil from making it to the shores and having an impact on the wetlands and beaches of the northern Gulf of Mexico. The crude oil actually hit the beaches 9 days after the explosion. So that was their first goal that didn't work. And as you know, the one of stopping the crude didn't happen until July 15th. So they didn't meet any of their initial goals they had set forth. The crude oil migrated into the wetlands, marshes, estuaries, and beaches of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida. There are two human populations